Welcome back to Meta Matters, Insights and Innovations. I am your host, Dr. Omar Young, and it's great to be here. Our last episode was about what makes an effective preceptor and what makes a great clerkship. Um, and I thought, we had such a fascinating conversation that we had to get not just a faculty and administrator's perspective on that, but actually talking to someone that actually is living that life right now in the form of a medical student. So we have a medical student today who I'm going to have a conversation with and see exactly what it means to be on a clinical clerkship. I did this many years ago. We don't have to talk about that. But it's going to be really interesting to see exactly what it means to be a clinical clerk in this day and age. So I will welcome the medical student here, Bren Cameron, and I'll let her introduce herself to everyone.
Hi, everybody. Thank you so much, Dr. Young, for having me. I'm super excited because it truly is just yesterday that I have done a lot of the third year rotations. And now, as a current fourth year medical student at UNC, I feel like I've worked with so many different types of preceptors. It's exciting to be able to get the chance to share what has worked well and also what has not worked as well during this time.
Great. Thanks, Brent, for being here. And also returning for this episode is Dr. Noor, Dr. Kraus, and Kayla here, all to continue this really important conversation on what it means to be a preceptor. Just to ground us. So, one of the things that I took away from last episode was, you know, we are, as preceptors are really formative for our medical students. And how we teach, how we instruct and behave really has a influence on our medical students. So I think that is why I wanted to have one of our own medical students come and talk to us and get a perspective on what it means to be a student in these clerkships. Um, so, Bren, in the spirit of other hosts, and I just want to know exactly, tell us your story and how did you come to medicine?
Absolutely. I am from Raleigh, so right down the street from Chapel Hill. But even starting like at a young age, I was always really adventurous, curious in science, but didn't really know yet what that meant. And even though like I was spending a lot of time doing soccer and like all these other activities, school was always something that I enjoyed. And so as I moved along, I didn't know exactly where I wanted it to take me, but I knew that was going to be a big part of my future career. And I think even starting back at middle school, I know this episode is on preceptors and we're like focusing in on the professional aspect of that. But even like the words of my middle school counselor who told me, I would never forget, do what you need to do now so you can do what you want to do later. Just that spirit of somebody being very supportive, very encouraging, because sometimes school, the professional workspace, it's difficult, but having somebody who is willing to support you, I carried that along with me. And even though I didn't have anybody in my family who went into medicine, I was just able to really get great mentors who would help me along the way. And so I did my undergrad at Wake Forest, and there I was super grateful for the professors who really would set me down and say, okay, you say you're interested in biology, learning Spanish, like there's an opportunity for you to go abroad. And because of that, I was able to spend 6 months studying in South America and like taking the classes that would help me along. And even completing that, moving on to a master's degree program I did and working in clinical research for a year before medical school, all those different instances have just allowed me to now realize that I really do like giving back in a way that I feel like medical education allows you to do. And working with all those different people in different places allows me as a student to recognize, okay, these were the things that I liked in a preceptor or a teacher, and these are the things that I wish I had. So now as I move on, I can kind of carry those things along with me.
That's amazing. Like knowing what you've talked about, would I be able to get into residency these days? Probably not. But I think super, super awesome. And congratulations on getting through third year and tell our listeners what you're going to be doing next.
So right now, I am still smack dab in the middle of interviewing for my OBGYN residency, hopefully matching soon in March. And I know within that, I am really excited because as much as I've been a student right now as a resident, I'm excited to be working with medical students soon.
Awesome. Awesome. Well, good luck in the upcoming match. Um, since you've been through this in clerkship wise, tell me, what are you looking for when you are on a clerkship experience? Like, what are you looking for in a good preceptor?
Yes. And I will say for all the listeners, if they did not hear your great metaphor in episode 1 with what makes a good preceptor and how it's so similar to making a cake, because I really think that epitomizes what I'm looking for when I go in. There's so many different flavors that can all be good, but there's still those key things that you need. And for me, I think the three words that come to mind would be enthusiasm, good communication, and just somebody who's willing to engage you. And I think starting with enthusiasm, it's really hard sometimes when you have this busy work day, the teams are constantly changing, to remember that there's a student there who just wants to feel like they're welcome. And even if, as we were saying in part 1, your day gets really busy and you don't feel like you have the time to really sit down and cater to the student you wish that you could, it's always important to just recognize that if they see you say welcome, like it might be busy today, but at the end of this, hopefully we can have even 5, 10 minutes to just answer your questions. That will show them that they are welcome there, that you do want to work with them. Because sometimes it almost feels like as a student, you have people who might be in the hospital, like the academic setting, but they're there because they wanted to focus on the research and not necessarily that direct interaction with students. But as much as you can communicate that, those are the people who stand out in my mind as a good preceptor and willing to work with the student.
Yeah, I mean, it's you got to remember, like, particularly if you're in an academic center, right? Nothing is going to happen unless you actually teach people how to be that effective physician or how to do that PCR or, how to interpret those images. You all were there one day or in the past, and, we got to pay it forward. Otherwise, this whole house of cards is going to collapse. Um, so when you are on your rotations, did you get, objectives on what to do, and what were your own personal expectations about how to behave or how to conduct yourself as a clinical clerk?
That's a great question because there's always the standardized instructions that you see online before you start your rotation about these are the objectives that you need to achieve to pass that rotation. But it's different when you show up because that's where you can get a lot more variation, whether it's your resident or attending preceptors, in terms of what types of conversations you're having on that first day or at the beginning of the rotation that will truly set up what the days and future weeks look like. I have had great preceptors who will sit down and say, or as we're walking, even, it doesn't necessarily have to be so formal, but just ask, what are you hoping to do today? Or what do you want to learn? What are you working on? Because even as all preceptors are different, each student also has different goals that they want from that rotation or different points that they feel like they are at in their learning. And so being able to have that conversation kind of lets us communicate, like, I think I just want to work on my history taking. So I would love it if I can see patients, present to you, and have a discussion on how I can improve that. So those have been really helpful. But I've also seen it where you're just kind of learning on the go what a student does. And I think sometimes that works because even as a student being there, you're going to pick up a lot just from what are other people doing and kind of soaking it in and taking a more proactive role in your own learning. But it's always nice to just get that clear communication so you're not making assumptions on what needs to be done or what you should be doing.
Yeah, I'm going to open this up to everyone else. Noor, Alex, Kayla, what do you think you all are looking for when you are putting out a call for preceptors? Like, what is your gold standard?
I think in terms of ideals, of course, we want someone who is available. So someone who is like readily willing and able to precept. I like to just think about more so like basics or fundamentals of like what makes a good preceptor and if an individual would be willing to complete like these, four characteristics, and then go from there. And the first one that always comes to mind is like communication skills. Can this person actually capture learners' attention? Can they answer questions? Number two would be like assessment. Can they provide feedback? How well do they observe a student via direct observation or indirect observation? Number three is like their skills in teaching, and that's actually the way that they role model their behavior or their way that they employ patient care. And the last one is motivation. And motivation, I think, is always the wild card. And that's where the quote unquote ideal comes from. Because I think
Mhm.
motivation is what really amplifies those other three things that we see as basics that everyone pretty much has when they enter academic medicine. But how well you engage in student, how much of a relationship you develop with that student, how much you are able to push a student towards their goals that either you set out for them or they set out for themselves and ask you to work with them on. That, like I said, is the wild card. And some people have it more than others. But I like to think that it ebbs and flows depending upon who we are that day, what else we're managing. And I try to motivate people to have, more of that characteristic. But I think that luckily a lot of us in academic medicine have already a higher baseline amount of it.
So it's that internal motivation versus external motivation that I think really drives people to being successful. You know, I can motivate you to teach if there's some sort of tangible incentive that's available. And yeah, that will be of benefit to a student's success and to your ability to be that teacher. But ultimately, at the end of the day, it's what's internally motivating you to be that teacher that's actually going to be more effective for the learner. But it's also going to make you into a better teacher because you're going to have a crystallized sense of exactly what does my learner require and how am I effectively communicating that information? Because if I'm not able to, then have I really done my job as a preceptor? I'll let you all answer that question for yourself. Um, what do you think, Dr. Krause? You know, what are you looking for? You're relatively new to this space. What are you looking for as a gold standard preceptor?
Yeah, I agree with everything that Bren and Nor have said. And I think it comes down to, when Bren talked to the first thing she sort of mentioned is sort of that excitement for, for learning and education. And I think that comes down to sort of the ability to establish rapport with learners and to exhibit sort of this idea of role modeling and integrity and respect. And then also, I think using that educational space is almost like, in some sense, a partnership and a relationship with the student to sort of say, these are my expectations or my objectives for you, but also allowing the student the room to take their own ownership of the goals for maybe that clinical encounter and that experience. Because I think a lot of that ownership with regards to learning is what's going to help them develop those skills that they'll maintain throughout their career. It's sort of starting that early on because that ownership of what your goals are and your learning objectives is what you're going to take with you as you become a resident, as you become, maybe a fellow and a faculty member, and then in that sense, a preceptor as well.
Mhm. And Caleb, you've worked with lots of faculty and students, but from what you hear from students or how you've interacted with faculty, what makes a great preceptor?
Yeah, I definitely can agree with Dr. Noor and Dr. Kraus. It's kind of the internal motivation of wanting to educate students and give them the best experience possible. So I think, like Bren said, students are looking for someone who wants to include them and be open enough to communicate with them on any different aspect that they have questions on.
Cool, cool. So, Bren, I want to come back to you for a second. Um, you've told us you had some really great preceptors and you've had some suboptimal preceptors. Um, I want this podcast series to really be able to tell folks exactly how to transform into being that gold standard preceptor. So in order to do that, we have to really look at what it means to be a suboptimal preceptor, right? And so in your experience, when you've had a suboptimal preceptor, um, what do you think the impact has been on you? And I think, you know, in academic medicine right now, we have this really huge focus on wellness, whatever that means in terms of how you want to define it. But in this arena, how do you think a suboptimal preceptor impacted your academic wellness or your mental wellness or your emotional wellness?
Whew, that is a very loaded question, but it's so good. And I think the first word that comes to mind is it's just awful. Like just because as students, especially most of us are high achieving, we set high standards for ourselves. And every time you show up, whether it's the first day or the last day, you still want to be helpful or an asset to the team. And oftentimes, I think when I've been placed in a team with a suboptimal preceptor, it just feels as if my presence, which is required of me, is somehow hindering the team and just not getting us to where we want to be. And I think that definitely has a huge impact on wellness. Academically, of course, I feel like when I'm with a preceptor who seems more dismissive, not as open to questions, it can create that natural tendency as a person to just become less engaged. And that's not coming from a place of me not being interested necessarily in the team's work, but just because as that student, there's always that hierarchy at play, especially in medicine
Mhm.
where it's very structured with students, residents, attendings. You can easily fall into the trap of, okay, if they don't seem like they're open for questions, I'm just not going to say anything. I won't ask anything, just to make myself kind of as small as possible so that I'm not disrupting the workflow of the day. I think that can severely impact the learning opportunities that you can have as a student, even though it's so easy to kind of fall into that. And then speaking to the mental health aspect and also emotional well-being of being in a place where you don't feel welcome, whether it's work or outside of the profession, anytime you feel like you're unwanted, that's going to kind of make you question, do I belong? Should I be here? Did I do something wrong? And I think for me, working with a suboptimal preceptor has led sometimes to just feeling like frustrated with that situation, but even more so, just having those questions of, is it something I'm doing wrong? And oftentimes,
Mhm.
as a student, because we are working with people who have much more expertise in education, you can easily feel like you're the issue and then want to navigate how can I overcome that.
Mhm. No, I really appreciate you answering that. Our job as physicians is to heal and to teach. And when we aren't actually doing that and we're actually causing harm to learners, is really defeats the purposes of us being in spaces that we are supposed to be taking care of patients and teaching. And so, you know, we have such a profound impact, even from like a 5 minute interaction,
Yeah.
that we really need to be cognizant of, how we are conducting ourselves. And so I don't want to go home at the end of the day and think that I've ruined like 80,000 people by just, literally not speaking to you or not, you know, helping you to figure out information. Now, granted, if I ask you to look something up and you choose not to, that's a different story. But I think, when we have those suboptimal interactions as a learner, it really is something that is um, not, it really teaches us what we don't want to be. And I think that it really inspires some of us to actually go into medical education. Um, I'll open it up again to everyone else. When you even yourselves have dealt with suboptimal preceptors, how has that impacted your own wellness?
Yeah, I mean, I think this goes back to the very first question of your of this podcast of why I entered medical education. I didn't tell everyone, but when I was in OB clinic, one of the interns, I was assigned her clinic, and it was one of those situations where it was like resident clinic with some students, and you just pick up the first chart and you go. And I guess, some people had told me that like maybe she wasn't the friendliest, but I thought, I don't know, like she seems pretty nice. So I'll just like, choose to work with her on this patient. It's a postpartum patient. I walked in, sat down, started talking to the patient, had not been in there for more than 5 minutes. This resident straight up knocked on the door, walked in, completely ignored me, sat down, had a full conversation and exam with the patient, did not acknowledge my presence, and walked out.
Mm.
It was really, really tough. It was really tough. I thought to myself, again, as I said before, like, wow, I really hope I never display this kind of behavior. And on my worst days as a teacher, it makes me think of that experience. That, like, when I have my own emotional baggage and I feel like I have nothing more to give to the other people around me, I do at least try to outwardly tell everyone, like, hey, today is not my best day. I'm going to try to bring it either in 1 hour or 30 minutes, or maybe tomorrow, or maybe next week, once I feel like I can give you like more of what you need. But
Mm.
I just want us all to be on the same page of how much I really am trying to be there for you all. Right now, like my bandwidth is just like for this patient care. And sometimes I think we do like need to be that open about what we have to give, because you also don't want to be putting out negative energy and projecting it towards your learners without necessarily having that insight to know that it has actually nothing to do with your learner, which, and I think is in most scenarios when we have very egregious situations, that's what it tends to be, having nothing to
Mm.
do with the learner and really just more of a personal issue that is just part of, the ups and downs of being a professional. And yeah, I will also tell you that one of the best times I've had um, as a medical in the medical profession was when I received the worst feedback of my, I would say till now, my whole career. It was the worst feedback I've ever received, but the best feedback I've ever gotten.
Mm.
Uh, and so knowing that someone has cared, even though they didn't make me feel necessarily great about myself, was also incredibly insightful. So yeah, you can have a range of emotions, but it's important to know what to do with those emotions and also the origin.
Wow. I'm just gonna take a breath after what you said. That's really powerful. And for our listeners and our viewers, we are actually going to be having a episode or two on feedback. So that is awesome. So please tune in to a future episode on that. Um, I'm really sorry that that happened to you. I have a similar experience where on my very first day of third year, I was actually on labor and delivery and was told to read a book, and no one ever got me involved or anything or even give me an orientation. I sat at the desk for about 16 and a half hours doing nothing. So I totally feel you on being ignored. Um, and so I guess knowing there are those experiences out there that are both verbalized and internalized and not heard. How do you all, as clerkship leaders, and I'll talk to you, Alex, how do you deal with the suboptimal preceptor in these situations?
Yeah, I think it's jumping off of what Nora and Bren have talked about, I think a lot of it is just sitting down with them and sort of talking with them and asking to identify the specific challenges that they're having for them to sort of share that, and so that we can then work to provide sort of targeted interventions to sort of help them with what they're struggling with, whether that's, like we've talked about earlier, time constraints, all these competing responsibilities, the unpredictable nature of clinical teaching. What exactly are they struggling with, and what can we do to assist them, with either, some form of faculty development, maybe just working on giving feedback, like you mentioned, or how to better create sort of a more effective learning environment. And then also just encouraging them to think about it a little bit themselves, this idea of self-reflection, and maybe even just doing what we're doing, chatting with the medical students, the people you're working with. A lot of times after I've worked with a student and we've had, a clinical encounter I sit down with them at the end and I say, hey, let's talk about how today went. What do you think went well? What are some things we could improve on? And I want that feedback for myself too, so that I can continually sort of improve, as a preceptor. Um, and then the other thing I think with us being, sort of leaders in this realm is providing them sort of mentorship and even peer coaching to, just continually know that they're not alone and that we're going to provide them support because we know this can be difficult.
Nor.
Yeah, I would say that these are always really tough situations because they tend to be student initiated, and there's a lot of emotion that gets put into some of the feedback that we get when there's suboptimal performance from like a faculty, whether it be like a resident fellow or attending level. So I think like number one, just getting the facts is really important because there's always it's not just that there's two sides of the story, but there are two different objectives that are trying to be met, the learner and the teacher, and sometimes they can feel at odds. And I think that each actually have a responsibility. Like there's a learner teacher contract, is the way that I like to think about it. And sometimes we each breach a part of that contract, and it's kind of like a snowball effect. So I try to figure out, what are the parts that maybe the medical student is responsible for, and what are the parts that the teacher is responsible for. And usually because the student's the one that I talk to first, we talk about, ways in which some of that maybe negative or suboptimal performance can be improved or mitigated on their end. Maybe they felt like their teacher didn't necessarily give them a lot of learning opportunities. So how can they ask or engage in more opportunities on their end, right? Because sometimes if just straight up tell the other individual that like, hey, I got a report that you're not really engaging your students very much, it can either feel a little offensive, a little too direct. So I think that's one of the first parts. I think the second part is it's really important for us to realize that no one comes in like wanting to do a bad job. And I know that I like already spoke about some of the really egregious situations that can happen that have a lot more behind the scenes as to why they happen. A lot of like these smaller things that seem like bigger things, especially for our students, are very subconscious for our preceptors. And so I think like being able to find a way to have a more casual conversation with them, and then again go through exactly what Alex said, thinking about like what it is that we think are some of our ideals or the objectives of a preceptor, and then trying to dissect where we think there's room for improvement, and speaking openly about like how there are barriers and there are some things that we can control and some things that we can't. And being realistic, like sometimes it's just one modifiable thing. If you do one thing, it can be enough. And I think that one of the things that preceptors probably don't realize is like when students evaluate preceptors in terms of like what they love the most about them, the number one thing, of course, is their clinical competence, is what students say. And then the second thing is actually the feedback. So it's like that interaction of like, how well did I do? How did I engage with the patient? What did you see when you observed me? And those are just some of those like extra minutes that can really make someone feel like not just that they're important, but that there was engagement. Yeah, I think sometimes it's very small moves that make big moves in the end.
Wow. You guys are awesome. And I think, these are really powerful tools that our listeners and our viewers can use to be the best versions of themselves as preceptors for our medical students. So I like to end every episode by something called a med-ed moment, and that is basically what you think people listening or looking at this podcast should take away. So I'll start with Kayla. What is your med-ed moment?
I think my med-ed moment would have to be understanding that there are two different versions. There's the preceptor and then there's their learner, and trying to understand both sides and understand that each person has different wants and needs from, a preceptor, what they want from the medical student, and then what the medical student wants from the preceptor. And so it's just communicating and understanding that there are two different sides that are coming together to make the learning experience for both parties.
Bren?
As a medical student, I'm hoping that all the preceptors listening will just know that they should be clear, be excited, and make your student feel like they belong, because building that rapport will just help them feel like they are truly appreciated and valued in their learning process.
Alex?
Yeah, and jumping off what Bren said, also understanding coming in as a preceptor, you may be having a day where you're experiencing a lot of those barriers to clinical teaching, but approaching it, as Nor said, with a sense of still trying to be excited, but also a sense of humility and honesty of where you're at, and just openly communicating that with the student, I think will also, bring a lot to that encounter, and also give room for even just tiny teachable moments that are very manageable.
Nor?
That we're all works in progress. And that includes like our professional and personal identities, and that we can work towards that progress together.
That's great. You all stole my med-ed moments. But I guess for me, listening to this conversation, mine would be that, what finding your true north in the realm of education. Is it to, advance somehow in a career, or is it really to leave your mark on the next generation, as well as to realize what you know and what you don't know, and that your career of learning actually never ends? I guess that would be my med-ed moment. So I'm appreciative to all of my guests today, and we had an awesome conversation, both in the first part of this episode of this series, and this part two is amazing. Please stay tuned for future episodes of MedEd Matters, where we are going to dissect the world of medical education even further, and hope you all have a great start to your year.